Ukraine's nation-building project, the whole hundreds of years of attempts to establish a state, the history of Russian imperialism, to try and frame the war more clearly for international audiences as a fairly straightforward imperial land grab, imperial genocidal campaign to wipe out Ukraine, which has been going on for centuries.
Hello, our guest this week on The Edge is Peter Dickinson. He's the editor of the Ukraine Alert blog at the Atlantic Council, and he also does a number of other publications. Peter's been in Ukraine for 20 years plus, and he brings with him a depth of knowledge as someone who works within media here in both the run-up to, say, the Maidan uprising, through the interim period there leading up to the full-scale invasion, and since then. His knowledge base allows us to discuss a topic that is very much important, and that is the information space, messaging, where it is successful, where it is not, on both sides of the conflict, whether it is Ukraine in the West or whether it is Russia. So, Peter, thanks for coming along to On the Edge. You've been living and working in Ukraine for 20 some odd years, yeah?
Yeah.
And primarily as a journalist. As somebody who's a Ukraine-based journalist, you, I'm sure, have seen the networks when they parachuted in. And they came here in massive numbers at the beginning of this the full-scale war here, but now they've kind of petered off. What is your take on how the International Press Corps has kind of approached this conflict?
Well, I think it's important to give it a broader view in terms of coverage of Ukraine going back like over that whole period to the 1990s.
Sure.
And because it was a major issue, and it was actually a factor in how we got to where we are today. Throughout that period until like late 2021, I would say, it was almost the rule that coverage of Ukraine came via the Moscow bureaus.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the case for American, for British media, also for the Germans, the French, the Italians, pretty much everybody. So whenever anything of note happened in Ukraine, a revolution, an election, a particularly large event, a Eurovision Song Contest, whatever it may be, they would send the guys down from Moscow, and you would see these guys coming to Kyiv, and you would meet them, and then they were very nice guys. Usually, I say guys, I mean men. It was predominantly men. It was journalists. But of course, they were all coming down from Moscow. Now, if they're in Moscow, by definition, there's a good chance they're probably Russians. They probably studied Russian at university. They probably took Russian studies. They probably had a passion for Russian history, culture, and so their perspective on Ukraine was already kind of through this Russian prism, by definition, almost. And then you factor in, the idea that a lot of them, they may have a Russian girlfriend or Russian wife. Their friends, their social life is Russian in Moscow. They socialize with Russians. They work with Russians.
They're consuming Russian information.
Well, to a degree, yes.
Not exclusively, but they have direct access to, the Russian media, which has a spin on it.
Certainly, I wouldn't. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't overstate that aspect of it. I think that these are smart guys to know.
They're smart enough, general, and the guys I know in the Moscow Press Corps are smart enough to see it through. But it's still there.
But it was deeply. What I mean is, it was deeply ingrained that they looked at Ukraine from their default position on Ukraine. It was through Russia, and then you factor in the idea that these people are dependent on accreditation from the Kremlin in order to maintain their jobs. So they know that there's certain lines it's better not to cross, otherwise they may lose their jobs and compromise their careers. Yeah. And so you put all these factors together, it was a real problem that the coverage of Ukraine throughout the whole period of independence until like late 2021 was very heavily covered by these Russian narratives. And they would put them in there in ways that they would not do in other issues. If they were covering, if you were covering France or Germany or any other country, you would not sort of impose these narratives from a foreign country. In fact, as now we see an enemy country, but certainly then it was already, it was a foreign country. But they would give them a lot of weight, and that coloured perceptions of Ukraine for many, many years. So one problem was the fact that Ukraine just didn't have a high profile. It was low profile. It wasn't on the radar. It wasn't seen. It wasn't known. And then the secondary problem, which perhaps arguably was larger, was the fact that this coverage was coming via this sort of Russian prism with this Russian baggage from Moscow. Now that changed a lot in late 2021 when the Biden administration started signaling there's going to be a war, we think a big war, and all of a sudden journalists started coming in from all over the world who didn't have this Russian baggage, who didn't have this Moscow baggage, and they started sort of having a look around and say, okay, what's going on in Ukraine? Let's try and get a grip on this story, and the coverage was significantly different. It was quite strikingly different, and all of a sudden you had a much more balanced view of what the realities were in Ukraine without this imposed sort of Russian overview, and it had a big impact. So when we got to when the war actually broke out in February 2022, there's already been I would say a real watershed moment in terms of coverage of Ukraine, and that changed. That continued, and I think the first year at least, I think we produced some really excellent coverage, some fantastic journalism, award-winning stuff.
Generally, I agree. However, I also found that it was a bit of a double-edged sword as well, because you did get you got this influx of new blood coming with a new perspective, but at the same time, you saw a lot of people kind of parachuting in without a lot of depth of knowledge of what's been going on here. I mean, I've been covering Ukraine for since 2001. You've been here, that entire time. This is not an easy story. This is Ukraine in and of itself is not an easy story. It's a very complex story. And as great as it was to get that influx of new blood, I also saw people coming in without a depth of knowledge and not quite getting it right. Where do you think the press corps has gotten it right, and where do you think it's maybe misunderstood what's happening here? The Russian crowd coming in with their perspective, but then also the guys who parachute in without the depth of knowledge. Where did they get it right? Where did they get it wrong, do you think, so far?
I think there is a sense of sort of short-termism in the coverage. Like everything is great and you're going to win everything, and then all of a sudden, and now it's more like, well, everything's really bad and we're going to lose everything. And there's a lack of perspective. There's certainly a lack of depth. And I think partly that does come from a lack of the background information about the situation. But I think it's also a sign of the times, this sort of breathlessness of coverage, that things have to be, this urgency, and you often get you get the headlines, again, a year and a half ago. The headlines were like, Putin's finished. He's done. He's terrible. What a disaster. Now it's like he's the all-conquering hero again. He's the sort of James Bond villain, or whatever you want to, however you want to position it. And he's marching on, and Ukraine's finished. It's over. And I think neither of those are true. I think neither of those were true, are true. But that's what they need to sort of sell this to brand this to international audiences. There was a tendency to sensationalize what was happening and what is happening and where it's going, and it's sort of the pendulum swing effect. It's going too far one way and the other. I think that was a real problem. But generally speaking, as someone who's lived here for so long, just the fact that the coverage has been so comprehensive has been a real breath of fresh air. And I always I try to do whatever media requests I get, and I don't really mind talking to anyone. I think probably draw the line with certain outlets, certainly the Russians, probably the Iranians, although they haven't actually invited me on. But as a rule, basically anybody, because I think it's important to get the word out there. But it always makes me cautious when I'm not seeing, people, when I see interest drop down, and you can see it happening quite a lot now. I think over the last, I think there's been a little pickup recently because the war has heated up, and there's a direct correlation between that. As the war picks up, the interest picks up, and the media interest picks up. I see it also in views on the platforms that I manage, and the media outlets that I manage. You see again, there's a swing up, not necessarily about the content itself, but because also the interest in Ukraine has gone up again. But that period of throughout 2023, I think there was a very significant drop down, and that's probably feeding the sensationalism as well. People saying, okay, we've got to make it, we've got to sex it up a bit to get audiences involved, and that doesn't always help.
No, it doesn't. And I you know, in an environment where messaging is really important, um, how has your impression been of the messaging coming out on the Ukrainian side? And then we do know that there's this massive information infrastructure from the Russian side of things with disinformation campaigns and everything that they do to try and color the world perception. Has the messaging been adequate from the Ukrainian side, and has it been adequate enough to counter the Russian messaging onslaught, basically?
Well, I think messaging is one of Zelensky's great strengths. I think he has as an individual. I mean, he's a showman. He's a show business guy. He's a showman. You would expect that to be his strong suit, and it is. I think he's been excellent. He's been able to consolidate international support for Ukraine in such a way that we take it for granted. We just assume that that's just the way it is. But if you can imagine, an alternative environment where, for example, Petro Poroshenko is still president, or Yulia Tymoshenko become president, or some other grey figure with a much murkier background from the oligarch sort of corrupt past of Ukraine, I'm not sure it would be as clear cut that the international community would have rallied as convincingly as they did. Can talk about how convincing that was perhaps a little bit later, but I really think it was a big factor. He did a really good job there, and he really he did an excellent job of mobilizing people. And I think that I always when we're trying to characterize it, I always look back to that video in like the second day, I think, when he comes out when he says we're here, here, and he's standing in Kiev. That was just that was his we will fight them on the beaches moment, the Churchillian moment, and that set the tone.
And the whole I don't need a ride, I need ammunition.
Yeah, and that was just fantastic messaging. He did a great, his whole persona. He's become this. You put Zelensky up there. Give me 20 politicians in the world today, and Zelensky amongst them, and show it to 100 people around the world. Probably he'll be the most recognizable. Maybe Biden, maybe Zelensky. It's going to be one of the two, I would imagine, especially if he's wearing his green T-shirt. So he's really got that brand now.
And contrast that with every single Ukrainian leader that has existed from 91 until now. Show me a picture, show your average Joe a picture of Yulia Tymoshenko.
Tymoshenko maybe is the standout there, but certainly Kuchma, certainly Yanukovych.
Show Poroshenko to your average Joe when he was in charge, and they would probably. But Zelensky, you're right. I think has codified that.
I give him very high marks. Specifically for that, his communication skills and the way he's managed to mobilize support for Ukraine. In a broader sense, Ukraine's messaging, it can be mixed. I think there's certain things they do well, certain things not so well. I think they can be a little bit too aggressive in their messaging sometimes.
How so?
In terms of demanding aid, I think they can be. I mean, of course, they need to get it, but I think there's ways of doing it, and there is this perception of Ukraine as being a demanding case, expecting, and they need to be aware of that, or however unjust that may be, and they've got to play that game a little bit better than they do sometimes.
And then when they express their frustration with not having enough of this or enough of that. I think sometimes they come off as appearing, ungrateful for what has already, which I don't get from the people on the street of you. And most Ukrainians I run into, when they find out I'm an American, even during that long stretch of time when America was withholding aid, I never got the sense of we're ungrateful or how dare you sort of. There's frustration and anxiety. But I never, in my daily interactions with Ukrainians, ran across somebody who said, screw you Americans, you aren't giving us what we need, sort of thing. It's always been kind of, what is going on? Yeah. What is going on with you people? Yeah. We're thankful for what we've gotten, but people are dying here, sort of thing. That's the attitude I got. And I agree with you. Sometimes the messaging from the officials or notables here kind of came across as a little tone deaf.
It can be. I think that's an area where they need to be a little bit smarter. But generally speaking, I think informationally they've done quite a good job. I think they could have done a better job of telling their story. This is something I think Ukraine in general has struggled to do. Rather than trying to sort of claw back or debunk Russian narratives, tell their story, which is a very compelling story in my opinion. And they haven't always done that. And that's not necessarily something you'd expect Zelensky to do, maybe, but there are other people who could be doing that who need to try and do that more to international audiences, because it's still not known. Ukraine's national nation building project, the whole hundreds of years of attempts to establish a state, all the different the history of Russian imperialism, to try and frame the war more clearly for international audiences as a fairly straightforward imperial land grab, imperial genocidal campaign to wipe out Ukraine, which has been going on for centuries. And that is something that's often
far before there was a NATO.
Yeah, well, this brings us on to your other point, the Russian narratives. I mean, I think Russia's got basically three narratives it's used, and they vary in their effectiveness. The Nazi narrative, I think, only really works now with the Russian domestic audience. I mean, it's been pretty badly exposed. I think it was very telling when Tucker Carlson himself, even who obviously came to Russia to interview Putin, to try and sell the Russian war effort, and even he said, like, this Nazi thing is the dumbest thing. The quote was, the dumbest thing I've ever heard, which I think speaks volumes if even he's saying that. I mean, it's been very badly exposed, and you've got Lavrov on Italian TV being questioned about how a Nazi state could have a Jewish president, and he's blurts out, well, Hitler was Jewish, or
and also the fact the entire press corps for a very long period of time, and yes, there's ebbed and flowed, but the entire press corps has been in this country off and on now, in large numbers since the large-scale invasion, including, by the way, I hasten to add, journalists from Brazil, from India, from all the BRICS nations, from what have you, and they have not been, they have not found these massive numbers of Nazis, and how this country is like. So it's I agree with you. So, I think that narrative is. So you said there are three.
The Nazi thing is your domestic audience. That's good for the domestic audience, because the Russians will still lap that up, because they're so into the World War II cult.
Take it too.
Yeah, I mean certain sectors of the internet will take anything. Let's be frank. I mean,
the internet is such a morass now.
Well, I mean, in any population, you'll have 10 or 20% of the population who's prepared to believe any nonsense you wish to give them. So, I mean, that's kind of unavoidable. I think that then you've got the narrative for the Western audience is the NATO narrative. Which is, it's NATO's fault. Yes, we don't necessarily agree with Russia, or even we totally oppose what Russia's doing in Ukraine, but. And the big but, it's NATO's fault, because look what NATO did, and that plays quite well. That still plays pretty well to a certain, especially I think certainly this sort of anti-American sentiment that plays very well, because NATO in America is basically seen as the same thing, one and the same. It plays well a lot of left-wing organisations, left inclined people on on the left of the political spectrum in every country in the West, where they are inclined to blame the West and assume, well, the West is probably responsible, because look what's happening in the Middle East. What's happening we see this again and again. There was this thing recently with Bin Laden. Some speech came out, and all of a sudden people were picking up and saying, "Oh, when you listen to it, it actually makes a lot of sense." And it's like that's the same sort of sentiment of the people saying, "Well, look at Putin, and he's being attacked by NATO, and of course he had to react to that." So that plays very well to certain people in the West, but I think it's been undermined by the Russian reaction to Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Because you've got Putin saying, well, this vague chance that maybe at some point in the future Ukraine will join NATO, we're going to start a massive war over that. And then Finland and Sweden say, we're joining NATO tomorrow. And Russia says, well, we don't care. It doesn't matter to us. It's like, well, you've got a border with Finland. Sweden and Finland together means that the Baltic Sea is a NATO lake. That's a massively.
It's not that Ukraine.
That's massive. It's not about. It's not about NATO
Ukraine
at all.
Joining NATO.
Yeah.
It's Ukraine.
It's Ukraine, yeah. Your problem is not with NATO, your problem is with Ukraine. And that really tells it all. Not only did they not do anything about it, they actually reduced their troop levels around the in the Baltic and on the borders with Finland. So that was really telling. And I think
the other thing that puts paid to that narrative is that the fact that, and it's so typical of what the Russians do, is to refuse these nations their agency, their autonomy, that NATO expanded east. Russia can never accept the idea that those eastern nations, as soon as they were free from a Moscow in trouble because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the first thing that they could do was run west. It's east, and NATO didn't expand east. The east came running west.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
and Russia just can't. I mean, when I used to live in Moscow, they literally couldn't wrap they think they do. There is this widespread perception in Russia of we are a benevolent empire, where you go and you talk to Georgians, or you go and you talk to Lithuanians, or even further afield, Poles and Czechs and what have you. They don't see it the same way.
No.
Yeah.
Well, I think they're exactly
so I think
right.
that narrative. That's okay. So that's two.
But it works. But it works in the sense that people. It works simply because there is a large constituency in the West, and there always has been, and probably it's more so now because the West is more dominant now than it's ever been. That is prepared to blame the West for everything and prepared to be self-critical in that sense. And George Orwell talked about this in the 1930s. This has always been there, and they lap up the idea that it's NATO. But again, it's not a majority, and I think things like this, the realities are starting to chip away at the myth. People are saying, well, look, if Russia really cared about NATO, why didn't they do anything at all to oppose Finland and Sweden joining NATO? They didn't do anything. Why have they not done anything over like 20 years about the Baltic states? On and on. So it's certainly not an overly convincing narrative, but it works for certain groups. The third one is like, so you've got the domestic, the West, and then like the rest, the global South, which is I think it's quite a curious term because it applies to basically the whole world apart from like the West and Russia. Mm-hmm. But they have the anti-colonial narrative is the narrative Russia uses for them. The idea that Russia is fighting against Western imperialism. This something that is immediately recognizable throughout this part of the world. And again, it plays to anti-Western sentiment there, and it plays to the lingering resentment about the colonial era, which goes on. There's a lot of sort of post-colonial. The relationship between the West and these regions is still, to a degree, colonial in terms of the economic relationships, in terms of exploitation and so forth and so on. So Russia comes in and basically says, yes, it's the same thing. We're fighting against that. So I think that's quite attractive to them in some ways. But I don't think it's that effective in terms of garnering support, because they're not giving that much support, a lot of these countries. I mean, if you look at the global South in terms of support they provide for Russia, I think that the Middle East countries, the United Arab Emirates, Dubai, places like this they're serving as sort of economic hubs for Russia. But they're doing that for their very own commercial reasons, regardless of whatever narrative is coming out of Moscow. They just don't care. They're like, whatever, it's your fight. We don't want to involve. We're just making money here. We're not getting involved. Yeah. And the Chinese, I think, they are helping Russia a lot. But again, they're doing that not because of some propaganda narratives or public opinion or whatever. They're just doing that because that's as they see it, their interest in their long-term struggle against the West and their desire to become like the dominant force in the world. And Russia's a very logical partner for the Chinese as a counterweight to the West and as a supplier of raw materials that they need to fuel their economic growth.
It's not out of real allegiance to Russia or to Putin as this this leadership figure on the global stage. It's realpolitik. What's good for me is to benefit from whatever Russia can provide us.
I don't
think there's an alliance happening.
Well, there's very few people who see an ideological affinity for Russia or what Putin is doing now. Very, very few. I mean, I don't know. Perhaps Belarus. Perhaps. I mean, that's really.
Belarus,
there's not many. There's not.
DPRK.
Even them, I mean, okay, they might, in the sense that they're anti-Western, yeah, but in the sense that like reclaiming lands because it's historically theirs and fighting wars, I think that's nobody wants to be anything to do with that.
There's the Serbs, of course, Serbia with its long-time ties.
Yeah, I think probably that would be one of the few areas where.
But you're right. The list is very short. The list is very short.
It's not attractive.
And aside from these narratives that you've outlined there's also it doesn't hurt. As good as Zelensky has been on the global stage, it doesn't hurt that Putin is like walking right out of a James Bond movie. All he needs is a white cat to stroke, sort of thing, and he's blowfield. Do you think this war has woken up the West, certainly, but even maybe further afield, has woken up to the world may have woken up to the threat that Vladimir Putin presents.
I think it's waking up. I don't think it's woken up. I mean, I think it's a very long process, and it's been and again that has a very long shadow as well. People have struggled to understand Russia for centuries, and they've misconceived it, and there's still a lot of misconceptions. There's still a difficulty understanding the idea of Russia as an empire. The fact that it is, Putin comes out and says, I am Peter the Great. Now it's my turn. I'm going to reconquer all this land. This is Russian land. That's Russian land. This is all going to be part of Russia. We're taking it all back.
Of course, the irony of them saying we're anti-colonialism when they're engaged in colonialism.
And you'll still get people saying, it must be, it's about NATO. And it's like, guys, he just told you what it's about. He says to his audiences openly. He openly says this is Russian land. These are Russian people. Ukrainians are Russians. There is no Ukraine. There's never been any Ukraine. I think these concepts are so off the scale for most certainly for Western audiences, they just can't compute. They just cannot compute. They can't understand. Nobody has thought like that for decades, maybe even centuries. Certainly since the Second World War. Perhaps with France and Algeria there might be some crossover there, and you could perhaps argue about Northern Ireland and the British, but it's really marginal stuff. I mean, it's wild stuff. The idea that this is a country that's saying we are building an empire, we are conquering a country, and we are wiping out their identity and saying you're Russians and you're going to be Russians. And then then you talk you talk about the threat. Well, okay, so if Ukraine is historically Russian land, what else is historically Russian land? And then there's a long list of other countries that were part of the Russian Empire for a long period, for extended periods, from Finland, Poland, the Baltics, down into the Caucasus, Moldova, of course, all of Central Asia. There's a huge number of countries that would logically be part of that as well. And why is Ukraine part of that and they're not? Well, I mean, you can argue yes and no about that, but I think it's very realistic that those countries are under a degree of threat, that he's going to see that. Why would he not? Why would you draw the line? Again, going back to the Tucker Carlson interview. Tucker Carlson went into that interview and said to Putin, so it's all about NATO, basically. I mean, watch his first question is like a very leading question. Yeah. So it was all about NATO, wasn't it? And Putin's like, wait a minute. And he just starts on this half-hour historical narrative. And it was fascinating thinking, wow, this is his big moment. This is like his biggest and by far his friendliest Western interview he's ever going to have. Yeah. This guy's basically just saying, here's your stage, lay out your argument, and I, as a high-profile Western journalist, will hand it, we'll present it to the West, and we'll basically sell you to the West. This is your moment. That was Putin's big moment, and Carlson did his job. He did what he said he would do. He gave him the stage, and he said, it's NATO, please, tell the NATO. Yeah. And Putin was like, nah. And he went off on his history thing, and it was like that was a conscious choice. That was like Putin saying, "I've got my moment. I'm going to use it to go on this rant about the 9th century, the 10th century, and he even brought documents from like the 16th century diplomatic exchanges, the 17th century diplomatic letters with Bogdan Khmelnytsky, correspondence. It's like, are you out of your mind? Are you do wonder, you think, at that point.
Well, and it also plays back into what I was saying earlier as well about how this is not a place where you can just parachute in. And Tucker Carlson is, I think, exemplified. I mean, he did it in his own particularly irresponsible way, as Tucker Carlson is wont to do. But it to my mind, it also exemplified this whole thing of you can't just wander into this topic. You can't just, as I say, parachute in. I mean, Putin goes on this tirade for 30 minutes in that whatever it is, however long it was.
It was literally 30 minutes.
Literally almost 30 minutes. And Tucker is not properly prepared to push back or to misdirect or to kind of that. Well, that's ancient history. What I want to talk about is this. He's not in any position to do that. He's out of his depth. And then, going off to the supermarket and all the rest of it. I mean, we could talk about Tucker Carlson. I think the thing I took away from the Tucker Carlson incident, because I hesitate to even call it an interview, is that he was totally out of his depth. He didn't know what he was doing.
Okay, but that I agree entirely. But I mean, that was interesting in the sense that it showed where Putin's coming from. And you ask about, are they aware of the threat? And are we aware? I think people are starting to wake up to that now, that this guy is going to go further. that this guy has.
Yes.
I mean, first of all, you've got the ideological foundations are there. They're clearly there. He's clearly on some sort of imperial mission. He clearly wants to reverse the verdict of 1991. He wants to regain Russian lands, and he's talking about that openly. He wants to justify that historically, and he thinks he can justify that on historical grounds. Again, so if he can do it with Ukraine, why not elsewhere? So ideologically, it's locked in. He's going to do it. He's clearly going to do it. And then you've got the material aspect of it. Well, he's put the Russian economy, the entire Russian side, on a war footing now. They are on a war footing, and they basically accepted it, as far as you can see. As far as you can tell, looking at Russia from the outside, which is always problematic in itself. But you could, there's no sign of major upset or resistance there, or certainly any anti-war movement at all. They're basically doing okay, and it's on the war footing. Ties with the West are cut, so he's turned his country decisively towards China, the global South. That's locked in. That's going to be long term. There's no real way back there. So again, he's in a long term confrontation with the West, and he's not dependent on them now. So he's on a trajectory that is towards a long war with Ukraine, and also the wider war with the West. It's hard to see that changing. It's hard to see that going anywhere. And I think people in the West are starting to realize that, and especially after the delays we had over the American aid, when the Europeans started thinking, okay, we've got Putin. He's getting more and more openly aggressive here. He's going to go further. We see that. They're already starting to do these sort of hybrid hostilities, hybrid acts of hostility. GPS blocking, cyber attacks, different mysterious fires and explosions and deaths going on. You're starting to see this coming up. And then on the other side, you see, and America's not reliable. We don't know where they are on this. We hope they're going to be there. We understand, and even now, although the aid came through, I think that sort of 8-month period was a massive wake-up call where they said, we can't just rely on America long term. This could easily happen again. Yeah. Trump may become president in November. He may not, but even so, who knows where we are? So the Europeans have started saying, we are against the clock now. We got to quickly get our act together. We got to start moving, because we're facing this very, very serious and growing threat from Russia, and our long-term security strategy for decades of let the Americans handle it isn't going to work anymore. We can't rely on that. So this has been a massive shock for them. And now you've got Macron now leading the charge. A couple of years ago, he was the guy saying, well, we mustn't humiliate Putin. We mustn't humiliate the Russians. Before, go back a little bit further, he's like, well, NATO's brain dead. Do we even need NATO?
In the UK, they're talking about possible conscription.
In the UK, the Germans were talking about possible conscription. I mean, Germany now is trying to create a war machine.
Europe.
It's massively.
It's changed Europe, and as a result, it's going to change the transatlantic alliance. I don't know why. This is the frustration I get, and we'll start to round down here. But the frustration, in some ways, I have is that this war is going to change Europe, one way or the other. Europe post the conflict in Ukraine, this open war in Ukraine, will not be the same Europe that existed prior to the large-scale invasion, and why that messaging is not filtering through to even Europeans, but certainly Americans. That this is an historic war that one way or the other is going to change the face of Europe, and as a result, change kind of history moving forward, because it is going to be this inflection point for Europe. Why isn't that? Why is that a hard message to sell?
It's not a hard message to sell, but I think it's a hard message to digest. I think it takes time. And people, these countries move slowly. Now, they're coming from a period of, Europeans, I think the West in general, certainly Europeans are coming from the longest period of peace and prosperity ever. If we're talking about Western Europe, it's like 3 generations of peace and prosperity. Yes, they've been waging wars here and there, wherever elsewhere, but in Western Europe, it's been the longest period that they've ever experienced. And then Eastern Europe joined them. And that was, when the Cold War ended, there was no real sense of jubilation or victory in the West. It was just like, yeah, of course, finally these guys got their act together and sort of freed themselves from this tyranny they were living under. Good for them, but that's just kind of common sense. It wasn't seen as like, oh, wow, we won the war. It's like, well, finally these guys got their act together and they are now joining us in like the normal world. and so to recognize that that's changed, that paradigm is gone. We live in a different world now. It takes time, and it's a very slow process. It won't happen overnight. You look at look at American perceptions of like, well, Europe's not pulling its weight. And it's like, yeah, you can show them statistics, and that Europe's more than pulling its weight financially. But Americans are so plugged into that idea. They're so used to the idea that Europeans aren't pulling their weight, and I think that's fair enough that they think that, because they haven't pulled their weight for decades. So it's
certainly within the alliance,
certainly within NATO alliance, certainly in military terms, that it's kind of like just taken for granted that of course Europe's not pulling their weight, because they never do they? So that again, that's another example where people are still sort of living in the past in a sense. They're not looking. You can show them the data, but they already have their opinions set. So. We'll get there. I think people are getting there. They are starting to realise the threat, and of course, the problem here is, of course, they'll only really wake up to it fully if it happens. And I desperately hope that it doesn't happen. I don't, because that would mean Ukraine had fallen. That would mean that the war has expanded. That would mean it'd gone further. So, I hope that we get to the point where there's a recognition to a degree that they act more, and we are seeing that now. We're seeing rearmament is kicking in. Again, that moves slowly. It's not something. It's not a totalitarian system where they can just say, right, everybody now goes to work in the armament factories or whatever. It takes time to kick that in. And that's slowly going, but it is happening. And the French are leading now a push, but Germany's been very good as a supplier of most weapons, which is incredible. At the beginning of the war, helmets, blankets, helmets and blankets, and that was, and it was like, don't go any further. And now it's tanks, whatever, yes, we still want the Taurus rockets, and people are sort of hammering the Germans. Give us these long range cruise missiles, and if you don't, you're a disgrace. It's like, well, think how far we've come to the point where Germany's being bullied by Ukraine to give them like long range cruise missiles. That's a big leap.
We're going to see F-16s in the air before too long here.
We're going to see
the fact that we had, but also then the fact that the Americans had to put Abrams tanks on the ground here before the Germans would send Leopards. I mean, that's a year ago, give or take.
More than a year. That was it. The decision was taken in January, February. So if we talk about aid in general, it's been far too slow, and it's been far too little. But again, let's take a step back and have a sense of perspective. It has been a lot. Let's put it this way: it's been a lot more than what the Russians expected. A lot more,
indeed.
which is significant. I believe that in the next few weeks we're going to see confirmation of French military trainers coming to Ukraine. And once that happens, the others will join them as well. So we'll have hundreds of NATO soldiers officially deployed in Ukraine. And maybe there's been a few advisors or commandos or whatever on the ground here throughout the war. I would imagine so. I don't know, but I would imagine so. And I don't think there's anything particularly controversial about that. But this is different because this is official deployment, and these guys are going to be here officially.
And it'll be overt. It won't be hidden.
This is what I mean. That's a huge first step. That's a massive threshold to cross. Once you've crossed that, then it becomes much easier to say, okay, let's get other guys in to do other particular specific tasks. And you can go from a very, very small core to a much larger NATO contingent. Now, I'm not saying they're going to be fighting here, but there's an awful lot of things that they could be doing as other than fighting, which would make a big contribution to the Ukrainian war effort. Ukrainians don't want them to fight. Ukrainians will fight. They've got the people to fight. They've got the skill set to fight. They've got the desire and the courage to fight, but they do need more support, and one of the issues is manpower. So if they can get these NATO guys in to handle other things, that could be a big factor. And we're seeing that again. Go back a few years, the idea that would happen and that the French would be the initiators of it. I mean, you wouldn't get odds on that.
Again,
you wouldn't get odds.
Yeah, again, it's changed the world, and it will continue. So, in as we draw to a close here, I mean, I guess drawing on what you've just said, will that be enough to draw back attention to this incredibly historic and important conflict? I mean, the world press has moved on in so many different ways. Now, Gaza, obviously, the conflict in the Middle East, what's happening domestically in the United States, the elections that are happening all around the free world, in the democracies around the world, that has drawn focus, I think undeniably, from this conflict. Will this kind of increase in international participation here, will that be enough to draw about? Or is there something we can do as the press corps, as messengers, as guys who are here on the ground in Ukraine, trying to keep Ukraine? How can we better draw the world's attention back to Ukraine, and also to get them to understand how incredibly important this conflict is in your estimation.
I think that the last point is key. The idea of hammering home how important this is in terms of what would it mean if Russia were allowed to succeed. And you can define, you can debate what success for Russia would mean, keeping what it's got now, replacing the government in Kiev, taking the whole of Ukraine or more territory, whatever it may be. If Russia is not defeated, there's going to be huge ramifications for the international community, and they're not going to be welcomed. Once they're there, people are going to say, "Oh, we should have done something earlier. This is bad." Even in the best case scenario, all of European countries will have to massively ramp up their defense spending. Now they're quibbling over 2%. Okay, try 5%, try 6%. How you like that? So wait till then you just look what that will mean for your infrastructure, for your hospitals, for your education system, etc. Because that's what it will mean. Without any doubt. And this is without having to speculate about what Russia might do next. This is just saying if Russia's not defeated in Ukraine, you're going to have to do that. And there's really I don't think anyone would really dispute that. So that's one very clear argument. Of course, then you go into much darker territory of Russia going further, of other wars, of invasions, of hybrid hostilities, of hybrid aggression, of attempts to discredit NATO, of little green men appearing in Estonia or Finland or somewhere, and so on and so forth. I think from a media point of view, it's very important to constantly put that message across that this could easily go a lot further. All the signs are there. Russia's preparing for this. Russia's openly preparing for this. The other thing I think is to tell Ukraine's story, to talk about Ukraine's role as a key figure in European history, not as some sort of obscure, unknown backwater somewhere, but a country that was absolutely at the heart of World War II, for example, which I think is so important. It was absolutely central. Hitler's main goal in World War II, as Timothy Snyder has often said, the Yale professors often said, Hitler's main goal in World War II was Ukraine. Mm-hmm. His main goal, and a lot of the fighting took place in Ukraine. Ukraine suffered some of the heaviest losses. It was literally the main battlefield of the biggest war the world has ever seen. And yet people are like, well, I've never really heard of Ukraine. What, did anything happen there? It's like, it was the center of World War II. It was the reason why World War II was fought, and it was the main battlefield of World War II. And that's just one example. There's a lot of examples of when Ukraine is central to European history. Yes. But that's, again, that story, because people don't always want to be told, oh, you're wrong about this, or that's wrong, or debunk. It's kind of dull and boring. It's not, but when you tell them a compelling story, as Ukraine has, this narrative of this country that's been in the shadows for so long, but has played such an important role and is now playing such an important role. It does reach out and sort of, it allows you to reach audiences that you might not otherwise be able to do. So there's a lot the media can do, I would say.
Yeah, well, that's why we started this.
Yeah.
So I'll do it if you will. Peter, thank you very much for coming today and sharing your thoughts. And it's been it's been a lovely chat. So
thanks for having me. It's been my pleasure, really.
All right, great. Thank you.